Coming up today, Uganda sees investors lined up for 5 oil blocks by end 2020. Billionaire Isabel dos Santos denies wrongdoing at Senangor. Plus, Deloitte dragged into South Africa state corruption scandals. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Business Incorporated. I'm Chimezi Obi Iwagwa. We'll kick off with the markets, starting with the markets here in Africa, where stocks are mostly positive. In Nigeria, the all-share index traded marginally down at intraday, while the JSE index in South Africa was up 0.17%. Over in Egypt, the markets were up some 0.31% at intraday, and the Kenyan bourse traded last on Friday, closing up 0.05%. In the Middle East, the markets were mostly in the green at intraday. In Abu Dhabi, the index was up 0.66%. The Dubai index climbed higher at 0.86%. However, the only laggard, the Qatari Stock Exchange, slipped 0.20%, while the Saudi Exchange slipped by 0.32% at intraday. In Europe, markets traded lower in the morning as UK lawmakers gear up to debate Prime Minister Boris Johnson's EU withdrawal agreement bill, while traders also track a slew of corporate earnings. Aside from Brexit, there are other news items rocking the markets, and Chelsea will tell us all about that from Frankfurt. Hello, Chelsea. Good afternoon.
Hello. Thank you.
So U.S. Attorney generals and drug companies are getting closer to a settlement that could resolve more than 2,000 lawsuits against the companies for their involvement in the U.S. opioid crisis. As a $260 million deal announced on Monday between 4 drug companies and Ohio counties is seen as a step towards a global pact. What could this mean for the companies involved?
Well, for the companies involved, yesterday's settlement really sets the stage for a much bigger deal. So there are about 5 companies that are currently talking to state attorney generals about a deal that would resolve them of all of these lawsuits. So they're facing over 2,600 lawsuits. That's an incredible amount of cases, an amount of courts they need to be in front of, lawyer fees. So they really want to settle this out of court. And there had been a lot of back and forth. There had been a lot of contentious negotiations between these companies and the state attorney generals, because the state attorney generals would like to see these companies giving not only cash to areas affected by the opioid crisis in the U.S., but also drugs, things that would help with addiction, funding addiction clinics. Now, the companies have been a little bit hesitant to sort of meet them in the middle. It does appear now that they're getting closer, though. So the latest figures are they're sort of talking about a deal worth about $48 billion. That is a bit closer to what the state attorney generals want. So yes, it does seem like they're getting closer. For the companies involved, there's really 2 types of companies that are involved in these potential settlement talks. There's really big U.S. companies like Cardinal Health and Johnson & Johnson. For them, a $50 billion settlement that they pay part of is not going to be a huge balance sheet hit, but there are a lot of smaller generic drug makers and companies like Purdue Pharma that have already gone bankrupt because of the settlements they're seeing. So there's really a lot of companies involved in this, and how exactly a potential $50 billion settlement would impact them, it varies based on the size.
In another potential landmark case in the U.S., a highly anticipated trial between ExxonMobil and New York's Attorney General begins today. Now, Exxon is being accused of misrepresenting the cost of climate change and its accounting. Could this court decision set off other climate-related cases?
Investors and lawyers are definitely looking at this as a potential test case. This is a pretty unique legal argument that the lawyers are making here, the New York Attorney General. In the past, the lawsuits that have been brought against oil companies for climate-related issues have all sort of centered around their involvement in this broad idea of climate change and what they should be paying to sort of help alleviate some of the impacts, things like rising sea lines and things like that. But this case is different because it's taking the approach of shareholder fraud. So the New York State Attorney General is saying that that Exxon sort of defrauded its investors by not being very front forward about how much this climate change could mean for their investments going forward. So I think if the Attorney General is successful in this case, it could definitely bring more cases based on this sort of narrow definition of shareholder fraud. And that would be a much different, it's a much simpler legal case than these other cases that cities and states in the U.S. have been trying to bring.
Okay, in earnings, Swiss Bank, UBS, today its profit fell in the third quarter following mixed earnings report from U.S. banking giants such as JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs last week. So what's weighing on UBS's earnings?
UBS is really struggling with the same things that a lot of European banks in particular are feeling right now. So UBS said its profit dropped about 20% in this quarter, and that's because, in part, these tensions that these trade tensions, economic worries, Brexit, that's all sort of weighing on investor sentiment. So people don't want to invest as much money if they're worried about the global outlook. But they're also dealing with negative interest rates, which is really difficult for banks here in Europe because they can't make money off of their lending. They actually have to pay whenever people deposit cash with the banks. So that's really hurt their ability to lend and to make any money off of lending. But at the same time, investors have actually been quite happy about this report today. It wasn't as bad as they had expected. And they've seen the UBS's wealth management business actually added about $16 billion in assets this quarter. A lot of that's coming from Asia, wealthy Asian investors. So they definitely are still struggling with all of these headwinds, especially negative interest rates, which are only getting lower here in Europe. But at the same time, they are still managing to add assets. And that sort of helped propel the stock up about 1% today.
All right, Chelsea, thank you for this update.